They didn't defeat us.
Why does no one go to the third planet? The trader asked it the way you ask a question you already suspect has a bad answer. Leaning across a table bolted to the floor of a station bar that smelled of ozone and fermented grelith root, 40 light-years from the world in question. The old pilot across from her didn't look up from his drink. You're new to this route. I'm new to this route. I've flown past that system 11 times. Every ship reroutes around it, not through the gravity well around the whole system. I checked the charts. There's no hazard flagged, no blockade, no debris field. She leaned in. So why does no one go? The pilot finally looked at her, and something in his face made her wish she hadn't asked. Because the ones who did, he said, didn't come back with stories. They came back quiet. And the ones who didn't come back at all, nobody ever found out why because nobody ever went looking. Behind them, on the bar's dim view screen, a star chart glowed faintly, and one blue-green world near its edge sat inside a perfect, empty circle that every trade route in that quadrant bent itself around, the way water bends around a stone. The galaxy had rules older than most of its citizens could name the origin of, rules that had calcified over 10,000 years of contact, conquest, and quiet accommodation between the 63 species who made up what everyone simply called the Concord. Most of those rules were sensible. Do not fire on a diplomatic vessel. Do not colonize a system with an active pre-industrial civilization without Concord review. Do not trade weapons-grade fissile material to a species that hasn't demonstrated stable planetary government. And then there was the rule about the third planet of a small yellow star in an unremarkable arm of the galaxy. A rule that wasn't written down anywhere official, because nobody who understood it well enough to write it down had ever wanted to put their name on the document. It wasn't a quarantine. Quarantines were logged, justified, enforced by Concord patrol craft with clear rules of engagement. This was something else, a habit, passed down between captains and companies and entire species that simply said, that one we don't go to that one. Most sapients who heard about it assumed it was superstition. A few assumed it was a hidden Concord military installation, something too sensitive to explain. A very small number, old enough or connected enough to have heard the actual story, knew better, and generally changed the subject when it came up. The trader, whose name was Ovid Cash of the Dren Trading Combine, was not satisfied with changing the subject. She had a cargo run scheduled through that exact quadrant in 6 days, and her combine's insurers had just quietly, without explanation, doubled her premium for any route that passed within 4 light-years of that system. So she did what traders have always done when the official record goes silent. She started paying for the unofficial one. It took her 3 stations, 2 very expensive drinks, and 1 favor she would regret for years to find someone willing to actually explain it. And when she finally did, it was not a trader or a soldier or a diplomat. It was a historian, a retired Vectier archivist named Senuvai Odd, ancient even by the standards of a species that routinely lived past 400 years, who agreed to talk to her only after she'd sworn, on record, to a series of confidentiality terms so thorough they'd taken 40 minutes to read aloud. You want to know why we don't go to the blue world, Senuvai said, once the formalities were done, settling into a chair that hissed under weight it hadn't been built to hold. Everyone asks it like it's a mystery. It isn't a mystery, it's a memory. The problem is that most people alive today weren't around for the thing being remembered. So tell me. 211 years ago, Senuvai said, the Drawl Compact, you won't know the name, they don't exist anymore, which is itself part of the story, decided that system was worth colonizing. Small, primitive, technologically pre-orbital population. By every metric the Concord used at the time, it should have been an afternoon's work. Establish an outpost. Catalog the population as a protected pre-contact species. Extract the world's considerable mineral wealth from the uninhabited regions and move on within a generation. What happened? The Drawl Compact sent an expeditionary fleet of 40 ships. Senuvai paused, in the way of someone who has told a story enough times to know exactly where the silence should sit. 6 came back. Ovit felt something cold settle in her chest. The population fought them off, a pre-orbital species. No, Senuvai said. That's what everyone assumes, and it's wrong, and it's the wrong assumption that's kept the truth quiet for 2 centuries, because the truth is far less comfortable than a story about brave primitives with spears driving off starships. The old archivist folded 4 of its 6 hands. The population didn't fight the fleet at all. The fleet fought itself. The story, as Senuvai told it, pieced together over decades from salvage logs, black box recovery, and the testimony of the 6 surviving captains, given under Concord oath before all 6 of them, for reasons never fully explained, retired from service and refused to speak of it again, went like this. The Drawl Compact's expeditionary force arrived in system with standard first contact protocols. Establish orbit, conduct low-altitude reconnaissance, catalog the surface population, identify defensible landing zones. The population, which called itself in the 1,000 or so languages it had not yet unified, by a word that translated roughly to the people in each of them, was flagged immediately as low threat. No orbital infrastructure. No detected energy weapons above chemical propellant level. Widespread, chronic internal conflict between the population's own political subdivisions, which Drawl Compact doctrine treated as confirmation of a species too fractured to organize meaningful resistance. That doctrine had governed 40 prior first contact operations, all successful, all textbook. It had never before encountered a species whose chronic internal conflict included, among its various subdivisions, individuals and institutions who had spent that species' entire recorded history compulsively documenting, weaponizing, and refining the art of predicting what any other group of that same species might do next. A discipline the population itself had never agreed on a single name for, calling it strategy or statecraft or simply survival. Depending on who was asked. The reconnaissance phase went as planned. The landing zone assessment did not. Drawl Compact Protocol required expeditionary forces to make limited, deniable contact with local leadership structures prior to full deployment. A courtesy extended not out of altruism, but because Concord review boards took a dim view of colonization efforts that skipped straight to force, and then had to explain the body count afterward. The fleet's diplomatic envoy, following that protocol to the letter, made contact with what its analysts identified as the population's most stable, most technologically advanced governing bloc, and opened negotiations for peaceful resource access. What the envoy did not know, because the population had never told the Drawl Compact anything it didn't have to, out of a habit 2 centuries of subsequent Concord contact would come to recognize as simply how that species conducted itself with strangers, was that the governing bloc it had approached was, at that exact moment, locked in an extraordinarily tense standoff with 3 other governing blocs on the same landmass, a standoff built on decades of careful, deliberate ambiguity about who actually controlled which weapons, aimed at whom, under what circumstances. The Drawl Compact fleet's arrival did not calm that standoff. It became, within 11 days, the single most useful piece of leverage any of the 4 blocks had held in a generation, proof, real or manufactured, depending on which historian was asked, that at least one rival power had made contact with an off-world force capable of orbital bombardment. Proof that demanded, in the population's own political logic, an immediate and overwhelming response, lest the balance that had kept all 4 blocks from destroying each other and everyone around them for the previous 40 years tip permanently toward whichever block got there first. What followed was not a war between the population and the fleet. It was a war the population's own factions fought through the fleet, a frantic, silent, extraordinarily well-executed campaign of misinformation, forged transmissions, intercepted communications, and deliberately leaked half-truths, all aimed not at destroying the ships in orbit, but at turning each faction of the expeditionary fleet against the others, exploiting rivalries between the fleet's constituent commands that the population's intelligence services identified, cataloged, and began working within 9 days of first contact. By the time the fleet's command structure realized what was happening, it was already happening to them. Fabricated orders, routed through compromised relay stations, the population's own signal specialists had cracked in under a week, turned 2 escort squadrons against the flagship. A leaked and entirely false report that one commander had made a private deal to arm a rival bloc in exchange for territorial concessions triggered a mutiny that cost the fleet its third-ranking officer and 4 capital ships in a single engagement, fought entirely between Drawl compact vessels, over a world whose population never fired a single shot into orbit. They didn't defeat us, one of the 6 surviving captains told the Concord tribunal in testimony. Senuvai had spent 30 years trying to get fully declassified. They didn't need to. They just showed us exactly what we already were and let us do the rest ourselves. The fleet withdrew what remained of itself 31 days after first contact, having never deployed a single ground force, having never fired on a single surface target, having lost 60% of its strength to itself. The Drawl Compact filed an official report calling the operation a failure of internal command discipline. It did not publicly connect that failure to the population of the world it had tried to colonize. Privately, within 18 months, the Compact's council quietly reclassified the system from pending colonization to indefinite avoidance, a designation so rarely used that most junior officers in the fleet had never heard of it before that report. The Drawl Compact itself did not survive the century. A succession crisis 3 years later tipped it into a civil war of its own. One historian, writing decades afterward, noted with some discomfort that the same officers who'd survived the Third Planet debacle went on, in several documented cases, to apply exactly what they'd learned there against their own rivals during that war, with predictably devastating results. Whether that was cause or coincidence, no serious scholar had ever definitively settled. What survived and spread quietly, unofficially, ship captain to ship captain, insurance underwriter to insurance underwriter across 63 species and 2 centuries was the habit, the rule nobody wrote down, the wide, empty circle on every star chart in that quadrant. We don't go to that ones. Ovit Kayash sat with that story for a long time after Senuvai finished telling it, the old archivist watching her with the patient, faintly amused expression of someone who has delivered this same silence to many listeners before her. So it's not a weapon, she finally said. It's not a shield or a fleet or some hidden technology. No, it's that they'll turn anyone who comes to conquer them against each other, on purpose, as policy. Not entirely on purpose in the beginning, Senuvai said. That's what makes it worse if you think about it long enough. The first fleet that came apart over that world wasn't dismantled by some grand unified strategy. It came apart because the population did to strangers exactly what it had spent its entire history doing to itself, out of pure habit, without needing a plan at all. It was only afterward, once word got back to the population's own leadership what had happened, and how, that anyone down there started refining it into something closer to doctrine. Well, they've done it again since. Senuvai's 4 folded hands unfolded slightly, a gesture Ovid had learned over the course of the evening to read as something between amusement and old grief. 6 more times that I know of across 2 centuries, smaller operations, corporations mostly, the kind of company that assumes a rule 200 years old must have gone stale by now. Every one of them left the system with less than it arrived with, 2 left with nothing crude at all. The archivist paused. The population itself doesn't know most of this history. They don't track who comes to look at them and leaves quietly changed. From their side of it, as far as I can determine, it has simply never occurred to them that they are unusual. They assume every species argues with itself this well. They have no idea they're the reason for the empty circle on your chart. Then why doesn't someone tell them? Would you? Senuvai asked. 200 years, 63 species, one very simple rule that's kept a species with no fleet, no orbital defense, and a population that hasn't yet agreed on how many governments it has, completely untouched by every empire that's ever looked twice at it. You want to be the one who explains to them exactly how that trick works and risk them learning to do it on purpose. Soviet thought about her cargo run, 6 days out, bending gently around a wide, empty circle on a star chart, the way every route in that quadrant always had. She thought about the 6 captains who came back quiet, and the 34 ships that never came back at all, and a species on a small blue world who had never once needed to fire a shot in their own defense, because the only weapon that had ever mattered was one they'd built without noticing, out of nothing but the very old, very human habit of not quite trusting each other, turned, without warning, on anyone foolish enough to hand them a reason to point it somewhere else. No, she said finally, I wouldn't. She rerouted her cargo run that night, adding 4 days and a considerable fuel cost to bend around the empty circle exactly as far as every trader before her had, and told herself, as she filed the new course, that it was simply goo. I'll tell you my business. It was not until much later, years later, after 2 more quiet stories reached her from other traders at other bars, after she'd stopped asking why and started simply avoiding, the way everyone eventually did, that she let herself wonder what it might mean that an entire galaxy had learned, over 2 centuries, to fear a species that had never once gone looking for a fight and had never once needed to.